A short video of I see a lot of people having issues with filament flowing out over onto the heat block, and I think this can be solved by threading the heat break farther into the heat block. Because what happens is, I think when the people at Creality, they thread the heat break into the heat block however many turns, maybe they count, maybe they don't, and then they slide it up into the heat sink. Well, there's a shoulder here in the heat sink, so the heat break can't go any deeper into that. So that's a set dimension from the tip of the heat break to here, and then they assemble it and they put the nozzle in and everything is fine. But what I think happens is, depending on the number of threads, sorry, my model is not presentation friendly, depending on how far they thread this in there. So let's say it's only threaded into here, and the nozzle is all the way tightened into the end of the heat block. Okay, so now you put bowden tube in here all the way to the nozzle. That's great, but what can happen is if your bowden tube isn't cut completely square, it could be in there a little bit crooked and it could still leak filament out, and it will fill up this chamber between the heat break and the nozzle. And I think eventually that causes an issue, that it will start seeping back into between, if your bowden tube isn't cut square. So what I've done on all of mine is you really have to thread this in. You have to, take these two bolts out on the bottom, take the set screw out, or loosen the set screw. And if this is not a brand new hot end, you'll have to do this while it's hot, which is tricky. So you'll have to take it off the heat sink, and then with pliers or something, thread the heat break into the heat block, a couple of more threads, so that the heat break is farther in, so your nozzle will tighten up against the heat break and not on the heat block itself. I see all of mine came with the nozzle threaded all the way up against the heat block, and that's fine. But it depends on where the heat break is. If they only if they threaded it in the right amount, then you'll be okay. But when your nozzle is tightening flush up against the heat block, you don't know, this distance can change. So if they only put it in a couple of 3, 4, I don't know how many threads would have to be, but there can always be a gap there. So what I do, and what I encourage people to do, is to make sure that your nozzle is threaded. If you see a gap there between the shoulder of the nozzle and the heat block, what that means is your heat break is probably threaded in there far enough so that your nozzle is tightened up against it, creating that metal to metal seal. Plus, now you put your bowden tube in there until it touches the nozzle, and now you have, everything is sealed tight. And I also see a lot of people recommend the hot end fix. Well, this actually represents a piece of bowden tube, the exact length of the hot end fix. And I put this tape on here because I didn't want to confuse the issues. Okay, it's sort of the same issue, but if you're using the hot end fix, this is even more critical, because if you happen to get an improperly assembled hot end and you do the hot end fix, which is cut to a specific length which has been calculated to be from the distance from the bottom of the washer to the tip of the nozzle, because this piece of tube is supposed to be squished between the washer and the tip of the nozzle. Well, if you have a hot end that is not assembled all the way, if your heat break is not threaded all the way into the heat block, guess what? You're not going to get, your nozzle's not going to seal up against your heat break, and your tube is not going to reach the nozzle or the washer. It will be in there. It will be touching one or the other maybe, but it's just not. If you're going to use the hot end fix, you really need to make sure that your heat break is threaded far enough into your heat block so that your nozzle is not tightened flush up against it. If your hot end is properly assembled, you should always have a gap between the heat block and the nozzle shoulder or the threads. And then your hot end fix is properly going to be squished between the washer, which is being held down by the coupler obviously, and the nozzle. So I hope that maybe sheds a little bit of light on why it's okay and actually good to have a gap or a space between your nozzle thread, your nozzle shoulder and the heat block. This is why. Because when your heat break is all the way up against the shoulder inside the heat sink and your nozzle is tightened up against the heat break, the distance between the end of the nozzle and the washer can't change now. The only variable that can change is the distance that the heat break is threaded inside of the heat block. So make sure your heat break is threaded far enough into the heat block for your nozzle to tighten against the heat break inside. Thanks for watching.